Ironically, it didn't even require anyone to be retrospective to understand that the solutions needed to help mankind survive and thrive were not that difficult. They were, in fact, simple. The only things making them complicated were the people who were trying to sell the narrative that the issues most of us faced were supposedly complicated. This was done in order to keep the masses under control. The biggest problems that humanity faced, which should have had simple solutions, were artificially made extremely complicated. To that end, there was a narrative created by the elite, one that would see them as the only solution to everyone's problems. For instance, the elite sold themselves as the only class of citizen who were deserving of all the money they earned, whether it was in service to themselves or as a disservice to those who served them. The wealthy petitioned and got laws passed that did nothing but keep the masses impoverished. Oh, there were those who were able to make a living and thrive while being the beneficiaries of the wealthy, but even those people learned the hard way that the elite never had their best interest at heart. As an example of what the rich did to keep the people down, let's look at the wages in America. While productivity increased year after year, the wages remained flat, stagnating as people had to turn to debt to make ends meet. Without so much as a single complaint, the majority of Americans signed up for some loan or line of credit or some credit card with a very high interest payment requirement. People were putting their medical bills on loans or on credit cards. They failed to even raise an eyebrow in the direction of the wealthy who were collecting on those debts. The rich also began to buy up all of the real estate that they could, effectively putting others out of that market. Billionaires like Bill Gates became the largest holders of farmland, and once this happened, they controlled the food. Prior to this control, the rich bought up homes en masse. What should have been shelter for the majority became rental spaces, where most owned nothing and none could complain because all freedoms were slowly eroded and stripped away from the masses. Few, if any, could dispute or argue against what was being told to most people. Anytime someone sought to address grievances or to bring them to the forefront, they were lambasted or mocked or canceled outright. Life imitated art, as the world that most people knew began to resemble dystopian books like 1984 or A Brave New World. As people were forced to surrender more and more of their wealth, which in turn meant surrendering more and more of their future and the futures of their descendants, those who attempted to stand against the rich were deemed communist or liberal or progressive, as if those things were bad. Any country that sought to serve its people, especially those with socialist governments, were deemed failures. This their enemies did, while placing sanctions on those countries. What no one seemed to realize was that if the socialist governments were so bad as the wealthy and capitalist nations declared, then why would there be a need to place sanctions on those countries? Why not simply let those countries succeed or fail based on their own merits or demerits? Americans had failed to use their analytical thinking to consider what was being told to them and sold to them as opposed to what they were seeing in reality. The rich continuously claimed that the economy was great. Americans continuously believed that the economy was great, even as their own personal economies were failing. At some point, it became simply a matter of most Americans blaming themselves for their failures, because after a while, there were no other people upon whom they could place the blame. Even though the rich controlled all of the money that was circulating through America's economy, the masses never thought to blame those who held and controlled most of the money for any failures in said economy. The fault for the systemic failures in America's economy always falling squarely on the shoulders of those who had the least power and control over those economies, the poor. The only time that American politicians didn't blame the poor being when they were blaming professions like teachers, firefighters, and the police for the strain on the economy. As a side note, even when the elite blamed the police for being a drag on the economy, those same police never failed to answer the call of the elites when protests like Occupy Wall Street threatened the tenuous control those same elites felt slipping from their greedy little hands. Unions were continuously under attack by the wealthy, even though it was the unions that had made wages worth working for and the working conditions at companies better. It was quite astounding to see how far the rich could push the working masses without the working masses pushing back against their arguments, which made no sense if looked at with a rational mindset. In a world with such manufactured and false narratives as those offered in the United States in the 21st century, lies replaced truths, obfuscation replaced clarification, and dishonesty became the way of the land. In the richest nation that planet Earth had ever known, food became such an expensive commodity that corporations like Walmart began to offer $2,000 loans for food at their stores. Cars, trucks, and other vehicles became as expensive as houses were just a couple decades prior. Homes became things of the past for many prospective home buyers as corporations outbid them with cash offers that exceeded the true value of those homes. The economy was alleged as being great, while for most, this was the furthest thing from the truth. Medical bills became the main source of bankruptcies as people found themselves floundering in what was supposedly the greatest democracy on planet Earth. Climate change was claimed to be an existential threat to humanity as the rising of the seas was reported to be a future problem that all of humanity would have to face. Meanwhile, the wealthy and the elite were buying up beachfront property or properties located right on the water as they professed that the seas would soon rise at least 14 feet. That's one way to get people who live on the water to sell their homes. You could also deny water to those homes under threat of being burnt by encroaching wildfires. I'm not saying that this is what happened, just pointing out the possibility. And adding insult to injury, these same individuals were also flying around in private jets and claiming that they had offset their carbon footprint by purchasing carbon offsets. This all sounded quite hollow and irrelevant, as those carbon offsets would in no way heal the planet in the end. How could the money of billionaires like Bill Gates serve to mitigate climate change in the long run? Perhaps it would have simply been better to not fly in private jets at all. And then there was the threat to the food supply. The food supply. Farmers all around the planet were attacked due to supposed climate change concerns. While troublesome in and of themselves, the biggest problem with these attacks was that those who were attacking never offered a solution or alternative for the farmers, but instead simply sought to shut those farmers down. Attacking the food supply chain, though seemingly irrational, was ignored by the majority of people around the globe, as these family farms and other small corporate farms were put out of business and replaced by bigger competitors or people like Bill Gates, who owned more farmland than anyone else in America. It was quite perplexing to see how the food supply chain was allowed to be attacked by the authorities and those in leadership without the slightest idea as to how to fix the problem. Their plan simply being to put the farmers out of business and replace them with people who simply had more money, not people who had passion for farming or who had been doing farming for years or decades. Just replace them with people who had more money. On the military front, wars were started to enforce peace, while peace never seemed to break out anywhere that those who claimed to be fighting for peace started one conflict after another. Then there were all of the medications that pharmaceutical companies were increasingly allowed to force upon the population. Though a practice that had started prior to the COVID outbreak, the policy of forcing experimental and not fully tested medications on the public really went into overdrive after that particular virus propagated across the planet. Far too many people were accepting of the lies and misinformation put out by the pharmaceutical companies as to the efficacy and safety of the vaccines meant to prevent or mitigate various illnesses. And the reporting on such matters became secondary, as more reporters tasked with the unspoken agreement of delivering the truth were paid by those who they were supposed to be holding accountable. Not even supposedly independent news sources could be trusted in the end, as was made apparent when the platform known as TikTok was sold to a billionaire with a vested interest in a favorable narrative for the genocide occurring in Gaza. Just before the collapse, all that one had to do was simply believe the exact opposite of whatever American leaders and media was saying, because eventually they didn't even try to hide their true intent.